developing a plan together. Even if the project has global impact, it should be place-based and linked to current community needs. In developing a project in response to a community issue, the design and scale should align with available and potential resources. This is a time to identify and apply for grants that fits within the scale and timing of the project, and for also developing a pitch. While this requires an adaptive and organic process, this development stage should be methodically carried through. By closely paying attention to differences and bringing partners to reach consensus and setting goals for everyone to agree upon. It is important to keep attending to the power of co-creation and the unknown without preconceived ideas for goals and roles. However, the group should work towards developing clear common goals and roles each partner has chosen. And also, it is important to assess needs that the partners might not be able to fulfill. And last, holding relationship. Clarina McLeod's statement, "The rigor is in the relationship," was shared by many of the interviewees that we spoke to, included Alexis Prats, who also stated that humility and vulnerability are important in discovering answers together. And this is really speak to this time of holding a relationship and a time to check in and ask for feedback, and also to reflect on the dynamic of the group. It's important to continue fostering open conversation and choose or refine a method and language to address concerns and solve conflict. Also, as role as being defined, it is important to create a system of co-budgeting and really being transparent about the compensations for everyone in order to avoid partners to feel maybe undervalued. And last, but really important, is to really make sure to take the time to celebrate each step. So this is a brief presentation of this listing phase. And as Patrick always said, we have the pleasure to have Eve Mosher tonight with us from Scotland, where it's almost midnight, I believe. And Eve is a cultural change entrepreneur working at the front lines of climate change and the urban environment. She creates space for and putting forth possible futures. Her work explores individual agency in transforming the systems that have led to this moment. She is uplifting what is possible through creative engagement, multi-sensory collaboration, and radical imagination. She has been creatively working on the climate crisis since 2007, but none of her previous experience, accolades, press or degrees have adequately prepared her for the moment we were in. And you can find Eve's personal website here if you want to learn more about Eve's work, but it's my pleasure to actually unshare my screen and pass it on to Eve. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emmanuelle, for the introduction. And I always want to check everybody can hear me okay. Okay, and thank you guys for making space for me to come in and share the work that I've been doing and to offer up my experiences for the work that you guys are doing as well. I am also going to share my screen. Give me a moment, and just to double check when I do this, let me know if my sound goes funny or if the slides aren't advancing, any of those kind of Zoom technical difficulties, just jump in and interrupt me. So I'm here to talk to you specifically about the sort of developing a plan process, but it's interesting to me to kind of review the work that's been done on these guidelines and to think about how I'm going to talk about a very specific project that I'm in the middle of right now, and how, you know, the idea that this is a circle is really interesting to me, because it is that these four things of creative, assessing, I can't remember, I'm sorry guys, what exactly they were, reflection, are actually constantly happening in the process of any of the any point in the project. So even in the making of a plan, you'll see as I get into it a bit more, we're being creative about what the plan is, but then we're reflecting back and we're iterating and we're changing and being really reflexive to the needs of what's happening around us. So I'll jump in, guys are not advancing, there we go, and just say that you guys are probably familiar with this concept of like success is not a straight line. It's actually a really messy process of how you get from one point to another. And I'm like, the plan in working in this way is very much the same way. There's not, you don't put a plan on paper and then that's forever and ever the plan. And that has certainly been the case for the project that I'm going to talk about with you guys tonight. So I've been working since late 2019 with the organization Trust for Public Land in Philadelphia, specifically on a project that actually has gone through name changes as well, but it is currently called Heat Response Philadelphia. And I'll just kind of step you through the development of the plan. And this happened, well, it kind of happened organically, and then I'm going to talk through sort of where it is now. So again, we wrote an application for a grant in 2019. We were awarded that grant in 2020, and we've been working since then and continue the project. That grant ends in 2022, and we're already thinking about how we continue to extend the work beyond that point. So the first thing we did was kind of identify some places based on a decision support tool that they had developed. And they were saying, okay, this decision support tool shows vulnerable communities that are experiencing higher levels of heat during the summer. In these neighborhoods, it can be up to 10 degrees hotter than surrounding neighborhoods. And we want to use creativity to elevate lived experiences and work towards changing that situation, work towards mitigating and adapting to the increased urban heat. So we said, okay, we have these neighborhoods. Trust for Public Land had developed parks or schoolyards in these neighborhoods. So they had been working in the neighborhoods already for a number of years. So they had developed relationships with the people who we are now calling in our plan the community leads. So you see here kind of this is our set of resources at the beginning of the project. You have the Trust for Public Land, you have me that have been brought on board, we have the locations, and we have community leads. And as we start to develop the project, I'm coming into it and saying, you know, I'm coming from New York City. I want to make sure that we're really honoring and centering this project in and of Philadelphia. So let's bring in artists for these, working with these three communities that are local artists. So we go through a process of working with the community leads to find and hire artists for these different neighborhoods. And then we're identifying, okay, we have these kind of people working on the project, and we know that we're going to need other help. So here's an advisory team. And for example, on our advisory team, we have someone from Department of Health and Human Services. We have someone from the Parks Department. We have Pennsylvania Horticulture Society, which is they do a lot of they run a big tree program and a lot of greening Philadelphia. We have a researcher working on urban heat with a specific focus in Philadelphia. And then we have people from the arts. So we have someone from the Philadelphia Museum of Arts. We have Mural Arts, which is a big organization in Philadelphia, Philadelphia Folklore Project. So we're also sort of centering it in the really rich cultures that exist in these neighborhoods. I can never remember all. We have someone whose expertise comes from sort of an evaluation background, and kind of looking at the advisory team is not only people that can advise all of us working on the project, but how can we actually influence them as well. So it was very strategic to bring city agency representatives onto the advisory team, and everybody sort of having access to everybody else. So that's our sort of resource pile. That's a horrible word to use. Sorry, pile's not the right word. As was mentioned, it's about 11:30 my time. So I apologize if I stumble over things. And then we also are starting through the process of kind of doing the initial outreach and gathering resources and figuring out where who isn't, what is this community feeling about this project? How are people feeling? During those initial outreach phases, we also started to develop other relationships with different agencies, both at a city level and a local level. So we're starting to build these other sort of assets and connections to develop the project. And once we've kind of got those resources identified, we went into a process of defining very skeletal framework for the project. So it's sort of funny, some of this is gonna look really familiar to the circles themselves, but we wanted to develop a project that was 3 phases at the really local level, the hyper-local level. So in this different neighborhoods where each neighborhood would go through a process of listening, collaborative design, and collaborative production. At the same time, we have the ability of having someone in my role who's kind of looking at the whole thing, and TPL thinking about this whole citywide impact. So there's a citywide project that's happening as well, which is seeking to connect the 3 neighborhoods to one another, building sort of a greater sense of resilience and strength between the 3 neighborhoods, connecting other neighborhoods in Philadelphia to the project. These are not the only 3 neighborhoods experiencing extreme heat, and then building capacity in order to make change. And then we lay out a path. And again, this is a really skeletal framework, knowing that others were coming into the project that would help to shape and shift the actual plan as it evolved. But what it sort of started out with was a concept that we would have the community leads and the artists working together to go through a process of outreach and listening within each of their communities, and research, sort of getting to know the history of the communities, getting to know the people in the communities, what are the lived experiences, and going through that process. Then going into a collaborative and creative design process for an undetermined outcome. Like, this is really important, and it's really hard to get a lot of funding from the art side into projects where there's not a predetermined outcome. We're really lucky to be able to convince our funder, which is Pew Foundation, I don't remember their exact name, they're a Philadelphia-based funder. And anyway, to convince them that we were going to go through this whole process before we even got to any kind of design. But then that last thing is actually the production of something and building in stewardship. It's also really important that we not just drop something in the neighborhood and walk away. So stewardship is kind of a really broad term in this scenario, where it means creating a path forward from the moment of intervention, which is supposed to happen in the summer this year. And then all this planning, and we got hit with COVID. So we had done all the planning, we got the grant. In January, I went down to meet with the community leads in March, and March 11th. And that was, as you guys are all hearing the anniversary, that was the day where everything shut down. In fact, one of our community leads, I didn't end up meeting in person because she had already been exposed to COVID. So that for sure threw a lot of things up into the air and required us to kind of reframe and rethink. And I think in some ways it's been really an amazing experience because it sort of taught us different ways of doing things. And we knew we were going to have to be reflexive anyway. I know from experience working within communities that are culturally rich, but sort of resource poor sometimes. There's a lot of things that are striking those communities, and anything could happen at any time that takes their attention from the project that I might be bringing to them. And so being able to be reflexive and meet needs in the moment is really important. So we've done a lot to try and respond to the unique situation of COVID in these communities within the work that we're doing, and sort of keeping that aligned with issues around climate, which it's all linked. We're dealing with this because of years and years of just like actual racist infrastructure decisions that have left these communities in a situation where they are hotter, which is also the same thing that's causing higher levels of COVID impact in these communities. So anyway, that hit, and we suddenly were like, okay, we have to now we're going on different paths with different groups, and we're looking at different community lead structures. And so now we've got a few more people at the table that are redesigning what is the plan. And so you see that actually for each group, instead of all of us kind of going on the same path, each neighborhood is now going on slightly different paths, both timeline, and we always knew it was going to be different paths in how they did these different things, what outreach and listening looked like in one neighborhood would not look the same as the other neighborhood. Now we're looking at different timelines. We're looking at different models of who's involved and how they're involved. And we're doing constant course correcting. There's the idea that a flight path is not the path necessarily that's, planned. It's sort of constantly veering off and going back on course. And we do that. We do a lot of iterating and a lot of looking at what's happening. How do we course correct and how do we respond to that? So this is kind of how we do that. Our course correcting is based on constant reflection, listening, adjusting, waiting, identifying, and identifying points where it makes sense to inject the project, points where it makes sense to inject our resources, our skills. We've done a lot of, figuring out where are there things happening, how can we support those things happening, where are there needs from the community, and how can we support those needs. So we have a document that went around and everybody kind of wrote their goals for the project, but those goals aren't necessarily the same thing as needs. So we do try and sort of fit those two together. We had a call recently with one of our community leads, and she was actually just like something had happened, and she was really feeling overwhelmed with the issues around safe streets. And so we're like brainstorming, okay, how can we think about, changing street crossings and creating more reflective pavement as part of like talking about this kind of heat thing? Or could we get the city to build trees as bulb outs? And so you're sort of doing dual purpose kind of inflection in the community. So, again, it started out as, it was never simple. I can't say that it was started out simple, but it started out kind of like this. And you might say, well, okay, that's how it started, and this is how it's going. It's gotten much more complex. There's a lot of different things coming into play. But really, I think the thing to really remember is that how it's actually going is there's a lot of this really amazing activity, and there are lots of different people participating in the project in really different ways, and all thinking about and talking about and caring about how heat and how climate change is impacting those communities and how they can work towards change and how they can advocate for change. And the city agencies are recognizing that maybe they can get really creative with the way that they respond. And we were really lucky to be on a call the other day with the agency that is involved with getting trees into neighborhoods. And we're, as the artists on the project, we're pushing them to like really think differently about how might you bring natural shade and trees in communities where literally the infrastructure is such that there's not enough space to put trees on streets, and how can we think differently about how we can do that. So that a fairly informal talking about putting together a plan. I wanted to leave a lot of space for questions and answers. So that's, I can stop sharing. That's my kind of
awesome.
My plan that goes like that.
Thank you, Eve. I was wondering, would you mind putting your contact info in the chat so that folks could reach you, even though your last slide isn't up? And maybe I'll just fire the first one out here. We've got about 5 minutes for questions. I was wondering if you could touch on what enabled you to keep a project moving that had so many different bumps and challenges in the realm of keeping all your partners together and motivated throughout.
So I should put up that slide that this is how it's going with the timeline. We built in pretty regular check-ins with everybody. So, you know, the Trust for Public Land and we have check-ins where it's like the core team working on it, and then we have a larger team so there's like constant conversations, and that's just about communications, right? Like that's pretty simple, and everybody knows everybody else and everybody's roles. We also have we've been having a lot of phone calls with like the advisors. The advisors joined on the artist call, and TPO and I went to the advisors and did like a feedback session. So part of it's just like the simple practicality of staying in constant communication with everybody. And part of it's just, I think, learning to, you guys talked about this, learning to listen. So I have to hold in my own work that Trust for Public Land has certain goals, and the artists have certain goals, and the community has certain goals. And those may not be exactly the same, but there's a lot of space where they actually can come together. So I kind of play that role that you guys identify as facilitator, which is not always the most comfortable role for someone who kind of sees themselves as the artist, but I've gotten used to it. I've done it a lot. So it's sort of constantly checking it. You know, I'll be in a conversation and we'll get all excited. We'll be going down a path, and it's like checking back and saying, Charito, who's our community lead, does this fit what you're interested in doing? Does this meet some of your needs? Or with Trust for Public Land, hey, we're coming up with these. We were just talking about doing a grant for some digital storytelling. And I was like, okay, but how does this work with you guys, your long-term goals? So I think just constantly, it's not course correcting, it's reflecting, listening, but it's constant, right? Like that circle that you guys put forth is not like it in itself is not like, oh, I'm going to do each one of these steps one after another and it's all going to be perfect. You're kind of constantly going around and around that circle.
Awesome. And I see Marta put a question in the chat. What's your definition of frequent check-ins? What does that look like for your team?
It's a different frequency for each group, as she pinged at the bottom there. So, and it changes over time. So the artists, we started off with a weekly call, and then we slipped to a monthly but longer call, and now we're back to every other week because things are kind of ramping up again. We have steering committee meetings that happen quarterly, but you know, we were like, well, that timeline is sliding. Let's move that whole. In the steering committee, we constantly have to remind ourselves who's on it. It's the core team, which is myself, two representatives from Trust for Public Land, and our community engagement project manager. What's his role? Community engagement manager. So hang on, it's the core team, it's the artists, it's the community leads. That's the steering committee. So that's kind of like the core decision-making body, which is a lot of people. Anyway, so we have like kind of quarterly check-ins with them, but then we also just went through a period where I was like, okay, we've been doing this about a year, let's do a reflection process. So Owen from Trust for Public Land and I got on the call with the artists and their community leads and did a reflection process that was less about like, let's do this, this, and this, and more about how's this going for you guys? What do you need more from us? Are you feeling like you're really a part of this project in the way you want to be? Are we asking too much? Are we asking too little? So we have our kind of constant get things done check-ins, and then we have reflective moments, which we just did with all the advisors too.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for your time. And I know that we could talk to you all evening for us, but considering it's midnight your time, I really want to honor your time. And thank you so much for your willingness to be here with us tonight. And call it for this portion of our meeting. But maybe, I think we don't get very many rounds of applause these days. If everybody can unmute, just unmute it, go for it. Okay, now let's give it a shot. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys. Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna, and good luck everybody with what you're doing.
thank you so much again. Um, and for folks in our art and science cohorts, if you guys want to take just like a 3-4 minute break, stretch your legs,